Welcome to this presentation on the evolution of the Astra Tech Dental Implant System, a 30-year progressive scientific development. This presentation is only 20 minutes, and it's very difficult to distill into 20 minutes 30 years of science and documentation. But what we need to emphasize from the very start is that the EV implant was developed as the newest iteration of the Astra Tech dental implant with a strong view toward the digital workflow. And it's based on the 30 years of sound scientific documentation that has preceded all other Astra Tech dental implant versions. Of course, we know that the digital workflow starts here with the CT scan. And in this day and age, we have the opportunity to virtually place our Astra EV implants into that scan. And that virtual placement is translated into a very real placement of implants, which ultimately results in what we would like to think is really the very optimal form of implant-supported restoration. This utilizes digital technology not just in the planning, but in the restoration of the implant, specifically using Atlantis CAD/CAM abutment design, and of course the new PrimeScan digital impressions. And certainly for me, this is delivering the absolutely optimal implant restoration, and that's based on having been restoring Astra Tech implants since 1990. And indeed, when you look at this evolution chart that you see here, you can see that the Astra Tech implant was first evolved in 1985, first developed, I should say, in 1985. And since that time has undergone a constant detailed examination of its strengths, but also its weaknesses. And along the course of 30 years, Astra Tech implants have been evolved to address any weaknesses so that we should ultimately strive towards the perfect implant. And at every step of the way, these changes have been underwritten by a core fundamental ethos of research and documentation. The other thing that fundamentally underpins the very many different iterations of the Astra Tech dental implant is the central features that are, shall we say, non-negotiable within an Astra implant. That is something that we refer to as the biomanagement complex. And you see here 6 different implants. They all share many similar features, but they are all underpinned by the biomanagement complex. There are 4 building blocks to the biomanagement complex: the surface technology, the concept of microthreading, the conical seal design, and the connective contour, commonly referred to as platform switching, which is an innate feature on any implant that has an internal conical interface. When we look at osteospeed, we have to understand that whilst this surface is very well documented in of itself and is widely recognized on a global scale as being one of the finer implant surfaces, it is in fact based upon much earlier concepts such as thioblast. And the osteospeed is really a modified thioblast surface. And we should be very clear that thioblast was the very first microtextured surface ever presented by an implant company. I placed one of the first Astra thioblast implants way back in 1991. And so I have patients with over 2 decades of monitoring superlative bone maintenance, not just around our current osseous speed surface, which is a fluoride modified tire blast surface, but even, as you see here, around the original tire blast surface. The next aspect is the microthread. Prior to 2006, you'd be hard pushed to find any documentation in the literature other than the Astra Tech documentation that referred to microthreads. It was an implant feature that had pretty much gone unnoticed by any other implant company. And then subsequently, over the last 15 years, let's say, there has been a plethora of studies documented on all different implant systems, all looking to mimic the technology first presented by Astra Tech. And again, this patient represents the first clinical patient treated with an implant, not just with the tire blast surface as it was then, but also the microthread, single tooth implant, upper right central incisor. I last saw this patient in 2018. I see her approximately every 2 years still. So we are coming up to 30 years in function with this implant in the next 2 years. And you can see, at least as far as it went in 2018, we have continued to maintain phenomenal crestal bone maintenance. This is aligned with the most important feature for my money in the Astra Tech implant system. And it's the original feature, the conical seal design. In 1985, this was the concept of an internal conical connection as compared to the classic external hex that really launched the Astra Tech implant. And back in those days, by the way, the implant was a machine titanium implant without microthreads. So really the only key features were the conical seal design and in the innate platform switch or connective contour that we'll talk about briefly in a second. My first introduction to the Astra implant system, as I've said, was back at the beginning of the 90s. And from a very early stage, I was fascinated by the mechanics of the joint design. And we undertook a whole series of studies throughout the mid to late 90s on the bending strength and micromotion, micro leakage, and cold welding properties of an internal conical joint versus an external hex. And here I just have 3 of my studies, but we have a really quite impressive library of documentation that has consistently shown across 2 decades that the internal conical joint is vastly superior, both in mechanical terms, but also we can say in biological terms. And that, of course, is why between the 1990s and today, pretty much every major implant system has converted from an external hex or an internal hex or whatever it might be to an internal cone. It is the quintessential implant abutment connection for any modern implant. And one of the advantages, as I said, of an internal conical connection is this innate step between the abutment and the implant. Today, most people refer to this as a platform switch. There are many debates and arguments as to why, if at all, a platform switch might impart superior outcomes to the biology, in particular crestal bone maintenance and healthy soft tissues. But one thing is certain. For nearly 30 years now, I've worked with this internal conical implant and seen superlative soft tissue results. And the Astra Tech implant is one of the only implants in the world that had FDA recognition for having a marginal bone loss value of less than 0.5 millimeter. Indeed, when we look across multiple studies over decades, we see that the average marginal bone loss that one might expect around an average Astra Tech implant with all of these four biomanagement complex features is 0.3 of a millimeter. I've recently had a meta-analysis accepted for publication looking at marginal bone data between the three major global implant systems, and perhaps unsurprisingly, there was a statistically significant improvement in marginal bone maintenance for the Astra Tech implant. Today, we're talking about EV. And there were a number of things to address with EV. First was mechanical robustness. Let's make our implant pillar as strong as it can be, because we all understand that there are inevitably risks over the long term, particularly for metal fatigue and mechanical failure, whether that be fractured abutment screws or fractured implant walls. And so our first job was to make the implant as robust as it could be. Utilizing the four pillars of the biomanagement complex, we also wanted to design an implant that was part of the digital revolution of implant dentistry. And this is probably, I can say, the first implant ever developed by an implant company that's really designed specifically to be used in the digital world, with a unique interface that we will talk about briefly in a moment. Suffice to say, the EV implant is available for all different varieties of Astra Tech implant, including the short implant and the profile implant. And today, we can also state that with new developments in the apical technology, we can achieve, combined with a step drilling process, superior levels of primary stability. Indeed, on these two images that you see, the profile implants actually show the old threading on the apex, where you can see the depth of the threading reduces toward the apex. But on the short implant shown here, you can see that the macro thread depth is maintained all the way through to the apex. And this has now been adopted across all types of Astra Tech EV implant to give surgeons the confidence of enhanced primary stability. That is, as I say, combined with the drilling protocol, which allows for a differential osteotomy diameter to the implant diameter according to the surgeon's perception for bone density, so that for softer bone, with a smaller differential, we can achieve a higher primary stability. And for very dense bone, we can make an osteotomy that is essentially the same size as the implant, so as to not over-tighten the implant in bone, which, as we know, can lead to pressure necrosis. For me, perhaps the most exciting feature of the EV is the one position index, which is highlighted by the red arrow. If you ignore the red arrow that you see here, there are 6 symmetrically positioned indexes, typical of most implants on the market, allowing for stock abutments to rotate in 6 different positions. But if you add a 7th position, highlighted in the red here, that leads to an asymmetric index, or to put it another way, a one position only index. And that one position only index is the index that's been designed for Atlantis patient-specific CAD/CAM abutments, which are, of course, in the digital world. These are digitally designed abutments. If we add into that mix the new prime scan with the scan flows, you can understand now that we essentially have a digital implant with a one position index that's easily captured in a digital impression for the fabrication of a digitally designed abutment and perfect fit. And so when we go into the virtual world, we can start to develop patient-specific abutments for either cement-retained or screw-retained crowns, including anteriors now with the reangulating Atlantis abutment screw, which allows for reangulation of the screw hole to the palatal aspect of anterior restorations. And this, of course, means that the crowns can be bonded in the laboratory. And so it addresses the issue of cementitis. Another really novel feature of the EV system is that although we have 5 different platforms, we do not, like many implant companies, use the same abutment screw. We actually use 5 totally different designed abutment screws. The reason for that being that we have a target preload that we want to achieve across the interface between implant and abutment, whether you're a 3mm implant or a 5.5mm implant. We want to pass this target of 250 newtons preload because research shows that above that level, the risk of screw loosening is negligible. And so by slightly altering the design of the head of the screws, we can ensure that with the same 25 Newton centimeter torque, we can always exceed the minimum required preload of 250 newtons. What does this mean ultimately for the patient? Well, for me, this is what it means. It means cementless screw-retained restorations using all ceramic zirconia restorations that are bonded in the lab to the digitally designed Atlantis abutments that can be guaranteed to fit precisely, delivering the conical seal design, delivering the absence of micromotion and micro leakage, so that we can ensure from a clinical biological perspective that we can deliver really good, well-fitting restorations with excellent marginal bone levels. And most important for me, that I could be here in another 30 years' time, as I am 30 years from when I started with this implant, still having never looked to have to use another implant system, because I get perfect results pretty much all the time when I'm using the Astra Tech implant, particularly today with the Astra Tech Implant EV. Thank you very much.